Every entity, whether a private agency or a public firm, has a limited set of resources with which they can work with and fund projects. Given those limited resources, they must be allocated in the most efficient way possible. To do this, we must engage in some sort of analysis of potential projects, deciding which one merits our limited investment resources. In planning, the most common approach to evaluating projects and determining which one merits our investment is through cost-benefit analysis. So what exactly is cost-benefit analysis? Surely you've heard that term used before. At its root, it's simply a mathematical tool that's used to answer the question, is this investment worth it? If we invest in this project, will the benefits of that project equal or outweigh the costs associated with that project? We can use this type of analysis on a number of different things, including the worth of a project, whether we should proceed with a certain set of programs, or whether an individual policy is worth developing and implementing. In another sense, CBA is more than just a financial analysis tool. It can also help us organize the list of potential costs associated with each project and lists of potential expenditures. Doing this allows us to better organize and think through the total financial balance sheets of a potential project, weighing individual projects against each other on equal footings. And there are a number of mechanisms that we'll cover in this module on how to stack up projects next to each other to clearly evaluate those benefits and costs. Generally, when we approach cost-benefit analysis, there are two general uses of the analysis. The first is by private firms, which only look at financial instruments, things like investments, stocks, bonds, when making a decision on what the most efficient and profitable investment might be.
A documentary called The Devil We Know was just released and describes the poisoning of a community in West Virginia by a DuPont plant.
It was used in consumer products, manufacturing products, and the applications were endless. These Teflon and Scotchgard chemicals permeated the living world.
And what is particularly interesting of this case is we're not talking about a fly-by-night company. We're talking about one of the most prestigious companies in the United States, a company that started the practice of employment safety, a company that has the best labs in the world. This case did not interest just the movie industry because it was very dramatic. Interested also me as a scholar of companies to try to understand why a company that in principle is one of the best companies in America end up doing something that ex post turned out to be so bad. And so in a paper with Roy Shapiro, what we try to do is trying to understand whether this was a mistake, was lack of knowledge, or was a more systematic result of a cost and benefits analysis. And while, of course, we cannot prove intent, what we do find is that they did have plenty of information, they did do a cost-benefit analysis, and while we don't have all the numbers of the cost-benefit analysis, projecting what they do provide as numbers, we come to the conclusion that unfortunately, polluting was a very rational decision. The profit maximizing decision for DuPont was to actually pollute the Ohio River and kill people. The question, of course, is what do we need to do to avoid a repeat of that situation? One obvious answer is trying to be more aggressive in enforcement. Unfortunately, that's very hard because the information is not available. Most people did not know what PFOA was at the time, did not know whether it was toxic, and certainly were unable to prove the degree to which it was toxic. And so to get around this problem, why don't we extend the whistleblower statute that has been introduced in 1986 for fraud against the government to actually environmental damage. Without inside information, it's close to impossible to know how dangerous these substances are. And we know over and over again of companies that do have this information, and not only they don't disclose it, but very often they portray to the outside world the opposite. This was the case for cigarette producers back then. This is the case recently for Exxon, and this was the case also by and large for DuPont as well. The second point is we want somebody inside the corporation to take responsibility. All too often in large corporations, big and unpleasant decisions fall through the cracks because nobody wants to step up and take responsibility, and everybody feels morally justified that the responsibility is of somebody else. And after the Enron scandal, we had a law introducing a requirement for the CFO to sign financial accounts and be responsible for the financial accounts. I think there should be somebody inside the organization, somebody who is responsible for the environmental decision a corporation makes. The third idea is to penalize settlements that don't disclose the underlying information. One of the benefits of trials is that they do provide reliable information. They are expensive, but they do provide information that is used by society in many, many ways. We want that information to come to light. The parties involved might have a private interest in settling without disclosing that information. That's the reason why I think that settlement without disclosure should be taxed more heavily. Our list of suggestions might seem a wishful list that will never be implemented, but I do think that documentaries like The Devil We Know make people aware of how costly it is not to have a better environmental protection. And while I don't expect any change in the next few months, I think in the long term, this pressure will make a difference, and we will have a better enforcement and a better protection of our health.
On the other hand, there's economic CBA. An economic CBA is primarily implemented by public agencies. It takes into account more than just the efficiency of an investment or the potential return on an investment. It incorporates things like welfare of a defined group and the general population's willingness to pay, marginal costs and marginal benefits at a group level or an individual level, weighing multiple different perspectives to determine if the limited public resources available are suitable for this type of investment. Drilling down into the public sector investment a little bit more, who conducts this type of analysis? There's generally two levels at which this type of analysis is conducted. We do this typically for infrastructure and health funding at the national level. These are big national problems that are better addressed by a national government. At a more local level is when we start to look at individual projects and infrastructure investments at a smaller scale, and these analyses are typically run by regional or local councils. Within the private sector, a number of organizations engage in cost-benefit analysis, determining if a project is feasible or viable from the onset, even determining if the benefits of certain daily activities outweigh those costs. And at even more micro-scale level, individuals sometimes will engage in this activity. Think about any purchase you've made. In your head, at some point, you've determined whether the benefits of that purchase outweigh the potential costs. Something as simple as dining out one night, or as complex as buying a house. Under what circumstances do we typically use cost-benefit analysis? To begin with, we use cost-benefit analysis to determine whether we should move forward with a single project. Here, if we're a public agency, we're looking at the public's willingness to pay for some project versus the costs associated with those projects. As a public investment, the citizens are the ones paying for the project ultimately. So the value that they derive from that project must be equal to or greater than the costs associated with that project. In other cases, we know we need to make an investment, but we don't know what that investment should look like. perhaps we're faced in Auckland with continued congestion, and we must determine whether we should invest in light rail transit or additional road capacity. We can use CBA analysis to determine which project is the best investment based on the perceived value and the actual monetary value over time. Choosing between alternatives is a very common application of cost-benefit analysis. In some cases, we may have already invested in a project. We may be midway through development of the project, or it may have been operating for a number of years. In any case, the costs have gone up, and we have to determine if we should continue with this project or find a new alternative to that project. So we can often employ cost-benefit analysis to measure whether an existing project is worthwhile or we should follow a new approach. In other cases, we may not know how large an investment should be, or how big the project is, or when we should start to invest in a project. CBA can be used to determine the best timing of a project and how large that project ought to be. In other cases, we may have a number of potential projects, and we want to invest in all of them. Perhaps it existed in a long-range plan, and now we just have to decide which one should be invested in first. We can use cost-benefit analysis to figure out which project has the greatest return in terms of consumer welfare or consumer surplus, and using those values in a cost-benefit analysis, we can then prioritize a set of projects we already are going to put in place. In some cases, we really just need to have some clarifying details about projects that already are in development or already exist. And as I said before, cost-benefit analysis can be a good tool to help organize all the different components of complex projects. So in some cases, CBA can be employed to just provide better information, or at least more organized information, on whether the outcomes achieved on a project justify the resources that will be used for that project. It can also help us clarify issues around multiple different components of a project, and typically, when we've done CBA analysis, we've laid out the estimated costs year after year. We can go back to that original CBA analysis and measure the actual costs year after year as the project progresses to determine what the status of a project is on any given year, what level of development we are at or should be at, and where the costs stack up to those estimations. So CBA can be used in a variety of different contexts. In an urban planning context, CBA is typically used in infrastructure planning, such as I referenced before, in measuring a highway investment versus a public transportation investment. Perhaps we're looking at an urban development program, whether we want to have infill development or greenfield development, which have very different cost structures but also many different benefits associated with them. We may be developing a land use plan, and we want to determine laying out land uses in a certain pattern or within a certain zone may provide a different set of benefits and costs, and using CBA analysis will help us determine where the best location for individual land uses might be, now and in the future. And in some cases, we may get down to the level with CBA as determining whether a standalone house or a townhouse or set of apartments should be developed on a specific plot of land. And so we might use CBA to determine what type of project should be developed. The list of ways in which CBA can be used is nearly endless. Even within the urban planning context, we use it for so many different things, or potentially for so many different things, that it's quite important to understand the mechanics of this type of analysis.